Maybe everybody's Uman already, I don't know. Okay, Erev Tov. Good evening, we're going to begin. Hopefully the rest of the people will among the roses. So he says, he quotes, Zeh sheshoneh halachot, one who teaches us, one who's studying halacha. So we're very, very appreciative to have Fink learn halacha with us. I know that many, many people have said, wow, halacha could be so beautiful. It's just amazing. So with a lot of gratitude, Fink.
Thank you very much. Good evening. As usual, I will try to express myself in English. If I slide into another language, just wave or something, and I'll figure out what that means. What we already know is that there are many problems with Peirot Shvi'it, produce of the seventh year. We know that there's a prohibition to market it, to sell it. All the more so, it's prohibited to market or give to a non-Jew or a non-Torah observance Jew who's not going to treat it with the proper respect. We know that once it has come into our possession legitimately, there are a ton of halachot which govern how we must treat those fruits. They are to be eaten. They're not to be traded commercially. They're not to be destroyed. You can, if you have the peels of the apple, which you're not going to eat, you can set aside the peels until they rot by themselves. And when they're no longer fit for consumption, and they are therefore no longer food, then you can toss them into the rubbish or the compost heap. We've seen up till now a ton of halachot which make the observance of Shmittah very burdensome. There's one more element that we have to cover before we talk about the two big solutions which are out there for all the problems. The two big solutions are Heter Mechira, the idea of Rav Kook, that the land can be sold to a non-Jew. And if you do the paperwork correctly, and the farmer signs his name on the proper document, Shmittah just vanishes from the world. That's one solution we're going to come to. Another solution we're going to come to is the favorite of some other rabbis, the Otzar Bet Din, a different document which, if correctly worded, the farmer signs on, and once his signature goes on the dotted line, all of the laws of Shmittah just vanish from the world. Well, we'll come to these two solutions in a moment. First, there's one more burdensome element in the whole of Hilchos Shmittah we have to deal with. So when we come to the solutions, we'll see how the solutions take care of all the problems. Here's the last big issue. The last big issue is called Sfichin. Sfichin means produce that grows by itself without having been sown. No one planted the seeds. No one tended to the crop. Some things just grow by themselves. For example, if you grow tomatoes, every year you grow tomatoes, and one year you do not plant seeds, even though you did not plant seeds, probably one or two tomato plants are going to grow anyway from seeds which happens to fall there. If every year you plow your field and sow the seeds to grow wheat or barley or whatever it is you're growing in your field, and one year you do not plow the field and you do not sow seeds, some wheat is going to grow anyway because some seeds fell from previous years, and some crops are going to grow by themselves a little bit. They'll grow a little bit without any tending at all. There was no violation of Shmittah. No one planted the seeds. They just fell by themselves in some previous year. No one violated Shmittah by tending to the crops in an improper way. It just grew by itself. It happens. Now, back in those days, I have to tell the truth. It's one of the rules. One of the rules of teaching halacha is you're supposed to tell the truth. And as embarrassing as it is, here goes. If you find it too offensive, just ignore what I'm about to say and make believe you didn't hear it, okay? Back in the glorious days of the Mishnah and the Gemara, back in the glorious days of Hillel and Shammai and Rabbi Akiva, back in the days when rabbis were rabbis, back in the days when Jews were Jews, back in the days when all was right in the world, there were Jewish farmers who were not Torah observant. Okay? There were Jewish farmers who were not Torah observant. And the rabbis were afraid that those farmers were going to commit a fraud against the customers. The rabbis were afraid that the farmers were going to improperly plow their fields, improperly sow seeds, plant their crops, do everything that you're not allowed to do during the Shemitah year. They were afraid the farmers are going to do it anyway in violation of the Shemitah year. And then when the farmer brings the crop to the market to sell, the farmer is going to say, I didn't plant the seeds. I didn't tend the crop. It all just grew by itself in my field. It all just grew by itself. Since the rabbis were afraid that the farmers were going to commit this fraud, they prohibited us from eating any crop which grows by itself, even though there was no violation of Shemitah, even though no one planted the seeds, even though no one plowed the land. They prohibited that because of the potential of fraud.
Is it kind of like a premises of Shmittah that all people can go to abandoned farms and eat? This is essentially...
Of course. But even in those days, when farms were small, and most of the produce was used for the farmer himself and his family, there was always a small amount that was brought to market, and it's that small amount that the rabbis were afraid would be sold in violation of the laws of Shemitah. Now, Sfichin, Samech, Fei, Yud, Het, Yud, Nun, Sfichin. The word is not used in other contexts. That's what the word Sfichin means. Now we understand the reason, and if you think about it for a moment, you'll realize that the underlying reason for the prohibition applies to carrots, potatoes, cucumbers, tomatoes, all kinds of vegetables which must be planted every year. That's basically everything that we say borei pri ha'adama on, all the crops which must be planted every year. Those are the crops which fall under the prohibition of sfichin during the Shmittah year, unlike apples, oranges, fruits of the tree, which are not planted every year. Everyone knows that if an orange tree is producing oranges, if an apple tree is producing apples, everyone knows that, of course, the trees continue to produce fruit every year. Of course, you don't have to plant them. I mean, anyone who's got a fruit tree in the backyard knows that even with no tending at all, that fruit tree is going to produce an awful lot of fruit. It's true that taking care of the grapevines, doing proper pruning and doing everything correctly will give you a bigger yield. That's true. But even if you don't prune, even if you don't fertilize, even if you don't do anything, you're still going to get a lot of apples. You're still going to get a lot of grapes. You're still going to get a lot of fruits of the tree, anything which we would call borei pri ha'etz, any fruits of the tree. And therefore, the prohibition of sfichin is limited to vegetables and grains, namely those crops which must be planted every year. Now that means basically that all of the vegetables, all of the carrots, all of the potatoes, all of the onions, everything which grows in the Shmittah year is simply prohibited if we are talking about the kinds of crops which are planted every year, which means basically all vegetables. Basically all vegetables are simply prohibited in the Shmittah year for fear that the farmers are going to commit a fraud, actually planting the crops and claiming when they come to market that it just grew by itself. Now, the first question which we must deal with is exactly at what point in time this prohibition clicks into place. At exactly what point in time does this prohibition become operative? Question. Apparently not, because the rabbis didn't, and that was back in those days. Today, yeah.
I understand, and I know that kashrut and Shmittah aren't necessarily the same thing, but we wrote about a down talking about a restaurant or something like that. There is a
Yeah, I had not intended addressing your question, but since it is a terribly important question and really underlies everything we're talking about, it deserves being addressed. So here goes. Let's consider this a footnote. Control F11 to open up a footnote window for a moment and bounce the cursor into the footnote window. Here goes. Here's the footnote. Not only Shmittah, but the whole of kashrut, whether it's kosher meat or kosher cheese or anything, the whole of kashrut, including Shmittah, depends almost entirely on ne'emanut, reliability, trustworthiness of the people who are supplying us with our food. Who amongst us, very few amongst us, actually slaughter their own cattle and examine the internal organs to determine that the animal was healthy. Very few among us produce our own cheese and so forth and so on. Almost all of us depends more or less entirely upon the ne'emanut, the reliability or trustworthiness of someone who said it's all correct. Now, the rule is as follows. Anyone who is Torah observant is assumed to be reliable, trustworthy, ne'eman, b'chol haTorah kula, regarding everything in Torah until proven otherwise. And therefore, if a Torah observant person says the animal was slaughtered correct, I slaughtered the animal correctly and checked the internal organs and I did the soaking and salting, I produced the cheese out of kosher and whatever it is, a Torah observant person says all is correct, the garment was produced without a mixture of linen and wool. If a Torah observant person says that, one should believe that person until there's evidence that the person is lying. The presumption is that Torah observant people are trustworthy. On the other hand, someone who we know does not care about the mitzvah, someone who wears garments with a mixture of linen and wool in them, someone who does not care about the Torah prohibition of mixing linen and wool in garments, we know he or she does not care about it because he or she wears those garments himself or herself. That person has lost ne'amanut, has lost their reliability or trustworthiness regarding the kashrus of garments. Someone who we know does not care about kashrut because they eat non-kosher food, someone who we know does not care about it loses his or her reliability in kashrut. And therefore, as long as we're talking about Shomrei Torah, Torah observant Jews, yes indeed, reliability should be assumed to be correct. Any Torah observant Jew should be presumed to be reliable until you have evidence to the contrary. Now, there's one big exception to this approach, and everyone is going to have to decide which team they are on. It's them and us. And of course, we don't think very much of their approach. But the two big approaches are as follows. Everything I have said is correct according to the Sephardic authorities. Everything I have said is correct according to the Sephardic authorities, both in private and in commercial situations. That's the approach of Sephardic rabbis. Ne'amanut, reliability, trustworthiness, both in private and in commercial situations, depends upon whether or not the person is Torah observant. Ashkenaz authorities, on the other hand, Ashkenaz rabbis say all of this works only in private relations between people. If you're eating in the home of a private person, not paying for the meal, someone has invited you as a guest in their home, if they're Torah observant, the rule is you should presume the host to be correct in kashrus until you have evidence to the contrary. But Ashkenaz poskim hold that none of this works in commercial situations. As soon as there's money involved, we need, according to Ashkenaz poskim, as soon as there's money involved, we need more than ordinary reliability. As soon as there's money involved, we need a higher standard of reliability, and that higher standard is defined by the Ashkenaz poskim as being mumche l'rabim. We need someone whose trustworthiness, someone whose reliability is accepted widely by the community, someone whom the community as a whole has accepted as being trustworthy. And that is the underlying purpose of all of the hechsherim, all the famous rabbis who sign on certificates that such and such is kosher, because Ashkenaz poskim hold that even if the producer of the food is Torah observant, if there's a financial interest if it's commercially produced, he's making money on the food he sells, then we cannot rely upon his trustworthiness. We need someone whom the community as a whole has accepted, and some famous rabbi signs on the certificate that supplies the needs of Ashkenaz poskim in commercial situations. Let me just point out, as a matter of historical interest, that this is one of the few cases of crossover between Sephardic and Ashkenaz thinking. The distinction between the Sephardic side and the Ashkenaz side, which I've just outlined, is the distinction which applies to modern contemporary rabbis who are Ashkenazi or Sephardi. If you go back to the Rishonim, if you go back to the Middle Ages, it's just the reverse. If you go back to the Middle Ages, it's just the reverse. It's the rabbis of medieval France, the rabbis of the Tosafot, who became the source in modern times, and it's the Rambam and the great Sephardic medieval rabbis who became the source of the Ashkenaz thinking in modern times. This is one of the few examples where positions have gotten reversed between the Middle Ages and modern times. But it makes a problem for Ashkenazim. But bottom line, if you think about it for a moment, you will realize that we are led now, our thinking process must lead us now to the following terribly important conclusion. I have tried for years to convince Talmidim of the truth of the following conclusion without much success, but here I go to try again on you people. Maybe my words will find an audience. I hear over and over again how people are concerned whether or not the food they eat is kosher. That's a question which occupies the minds of many people. Is the food kosher? I want to be sure that the food is kosher which I eat. Now, I personally think that question is not very interesting, and the truth is, I really cannot work up much energy to be concerned with this question. That's a complicated way of saying, I don't care. It doesn't matter whether or not the food is kosher or not. There's a different question which is far more important. The important question is not, is the food kosher or not kosher? The important question is the food mutar or asur? Is the food permitted or prohibited? And the answer to these questions is not necessarily the same. After all, since halacha commands me to rely upon the trustworthiness of someone who is Torah observant, of course the possibility will arise, and in the course of time it will inevitably occur, that I will be permitted to eat something following the rules of halacha, relying quite correctly upon the reliability of a private person who's Torah observant or a famous rabbi who's Torah observant, and it's quite correct that I'm permitted to eat the food, and in the course of time, it's going to happen that something's going to go wrong, and I'm going to swallow something that's prohibited. Of course that's possible, and of course that happens from time to time. It's more or less inevitable from time to time that mistakes are going to be made. Oh, but if I was permitted to eat the food, I did nothing wrong. And if I did nothing wrong, I have nothing to repent for. There's no reason to do tshuva. What's important is not, is the food kosher or not kosher? What is important is the food permitted or not permitted. And the answer to these questions is not necessarily the same in every case. Whether the food is permitted or not permitted depends largely on the question of reliability, trustworthiness, and that might, in certain circumstances, conflict with the reality of the food. Is that enough of a footnote? Control F11 will close the footnote window and bounce us back up to the main text. Now, what we know is that sfichen are prohibited. We know that vegetables which grow in the 7th year are prohibited. Now the question is, exactly when does that prohibition begin? There are two basic opinions, a strict opinion and a lenient opinion. The lenient opinion is that of the Chazon Ish. And anyone who knows the Chazon Ish, anyone who is familiar with the thinking of the Chazon Ish, knows that he was an extraordinarily strict rabbi. You know, the muscles in his fingers were so accustomed to writing the word asur, prohibited, he just found it difficult to take pen in hand, and the muscles were just not accustomed to writing that mutter, that word permitted. But in this particular case, the Chazon Ish is on the lenient side of the issue, and people like me are happy to say, if the Chazon Ish could find his way to be lenient in this particular issue, who am I to advise people to take the stricter approach? Here is the lenient approach of the Chazon Ish. According to the Chazon Ish, any vegetables, peppers, carrots, lettuce, whatever it is, any vegetable which began to grow during the 6th year, that's now, before Rosh Hashanah, and at this very moment, in the days leading up to Rosh Hashanah, there are plenty of vegetables which are beginning to grow. Any vegetable which has begun to grow before Rosh Hashanah and continues to grow after Rosh Hashanah is not prohibited because of this sfichen business. In order to be prohibited under the category of sfichen, the Chazon Ish says it has to be something which began growing after Rosh Hashanah. This means, according to the Chazon Ish, there are going to be vegetables on the market shortly after Rosh Hashanah, which were harvested in the 7th year, but began to grow in the 6th year, and those vegetables are going to be permitted. Since they were harvested, since they're going to be harvested in the 7th year, all of the restrictions apply to them. You can't market them, you can't destroy them. What's normally eaten raw has to be eaten raw, what's normally eaten cooked has to be eaten cooked. All the halachas we spoke about apply to them, but they are permitted. And this will, of course, work for the first few weeks of the Shmittah year. And exactly how many weeks it's going to work will depend upon the vegetable. Every vegetable has a different growing cycle, but those which began to grow before Rosh Hashanah and are harvested in the 7th year are permitted. Question? Sfichen. Sfichen, or anything which is Boi Pri Adama. Oh, how do you know which are which? Well, a city slicker like me, of course, knows nothing about the growing cycles of different vegetables. I don't know how many days it takes for a cucumber to go from planting to harvest. But there are people who know about this, and you can download on the internet, or you can get in any Jewish bookshop a lovely calendar which will tell you vegetable by vegetable until what date in the 7th year it's still permitted.
Are vegetables that grew on their own. So is this going to include the vegetables that were planted in the 6th year?
If they were planted or began to grow in the 6th year, they are permitted even though they grew into the 7th year. So if you acquire either on the internet or a Jewish bookshop a lovely calendar, it'll tell you cucumbers which are harvested until such and such a date in the 7th year surely began to grow in the 6th year. tomatoes, which are harvested until such and such a date in the 7th year, surely began to grow in the 6th year. For every vegetable, there's a certain growing cycle, a certain number of days from planting to harvest, and you can get these calendars which will inform you about those growing cycles.
And where things are harvested and stay in storage, and then are shipped. I mean, that's the commercial reality of agriculture.
Yeah, some things have to be very fresh, like lettuce. Other things, like potatoes, can take a long time till they get to market.
Right, and technically, totally going to the shop and asking the person who's running the stand.
He doesn't know. He doesn't know.
No clue. So
You have to equip yourself with a calendar that was put together by rabbis who really know the agricultural questions here, and these calendars will answer your questions.
so that's for sure, and I downloaded it. They answer what the harvesting cutoff.
Yeah, but
The same application has been.
yeah, exactly the same rabbis have investigated how long onions are stored between harvest and sale, how long potatoes are stored between harvesting and sale. These calendars will take care of all these questions as well. Okay? Yes. Yeah, anything, we're not going to worry about the 8th year now. The lenient opinion is that of the Chazon Ish, which I've just explained. Anything which begins to grow in the 7th year, in the 6th year, and is harvested in the 7th year is permitted, but since it is harvested in the 7th year, all of the restrictions of Shmittah apply to it. The stricter opinion, and there are people out there following the stricter opinion holds that it's not enough that the vegetable began to grow in the 6th year, but 1/3 of the growing cycle must be completed in the 6th year. According to the stricter opinion, only if 1/3, at least 1/3 of the growing cycle is completed in the 6th year, only then will the vegetables be permitted in the 7th year. Now, of course, for someone like me, who lives in what the Jerusalem Post calls an ultra-Orthodox neighborhood, according to the Jerusalem Post, the Jewish population of Israel is divided between ultra-Orthodox and secular. I live in what they call an ultra-Orthodox neighborhood. Of course, the greengrocers in my neighborhood, the supermarkets in my holy neighborhood, which is wall-to-wall Haredim, they only sell things which are permitted during the Shemitah year, and they have all kinds of rabbinic certification of that. So in practice, I'm not really concerned with these issues on a day-to-day basis, because the shops that I shop in simply don't have these problems because they're all under Haredi rabbinic supervision. But if you shop in Machne Yehuda, for example, then these are things which you must be aware of. The Eda Charedis or the other Mahadran Hechsherim do not give their approval to any produce which has any problematic nature to it at all. And therefore, Sfichin will not occur in a store which is, or a product which is under the supervision of the Eda Charedis or any other Mahadran Hechsher organization. Nor will they market any product which has Kedusha Shvius. None of the restrictions of the 7th year will apply to any product which is under the supervision of the Mahadran Hechsherim, the Eda Charedis, Agudat Yisrael, Rav Rubin, or any of the other Mahadran Hechsherim. Okay. Or they get it from non-Jewish fields. Imported means from the Arava, from the Golan, places which are outside of Halachically Eretz Israel, or it's from the 6th year. The Eda Charedit has at the moment a sufficient number of potatoes in storage to be able to market until Pesach. After Pesach, they're going to have to start. They'll have to switch to importing from Chutz La'aretz. But there are already enough potatoes in storage for to last until Pesach. Matzah Shmura which is made from Israeli-grown wheat, mostly in the Beersheba area. In the 6th year, double the amount of fields were sown, and the wheat, which is going to be used for grinding the flour, for making matzah shmura with the Mahadran Hechsherim, has already been harvested in the 6th year and is already in storage and is ready for use. Okay, so the Mahadran Hechsherim are designed in a way that the consumer need not be concerned about any Shmittah issue. If the vegetables were harvested in the 7th year, the day after Rosh Hashanah, Tzom Gedalia is the day after Rosh Hashanah. The cucumbers they're selling in the stores on Tzom Gedalia were surely harvested before Rosh Hashanah. But as soon as you get to the next day, the day after Tzom Gedalia, 2 days after Rosh Hashanah, the cucumbers in the store maybe were harvested after Rosh Hashanah. And if they were harvested after Rosh Hashanah, all of the restrictions of Shemitah apply to them. I haven't come to those solutions, but we're going to come soon to this. Okay, yeah.
Before we come to the other solutions, what do we need to know practically in terms of the orders that are installed? We need some people,
there are different opinions about exactly where the halachic borders of Eretz Israel are. There are different opinions, and if one buys produce or products with the Mahadran Hechsherim, you can be sure that the ingredients either come from Chutz La'aretz or from the 6th year. It shouldn't be a problem. You want to know where the borders are? That's a complicated issue that I'm not going to discuss now. Last time I mentioned a list of controversial places, and you can look back to the notes there. If you're interested in a list, Mahadran, it used to be that the Eidah Haredit in Mea Sha'arim was the only Mahadran Hechsher available. However, the public's interest in Mahadran Hechsherim has been steadily growing, and as the market share of Mahadran Hechsherim grows, many producers are interested in getting Mahadran Hechsherim for their products in order to increase their market share, and that market share has been growing steadily over the last 40 years. Today, there are many Mahadran Hechsherim out there, some of which are very shaky, others of which are quite reliable. If you want to know the only possible correct list of which are the good ones, just ask me. If you want, you can ask me. I'll tell you the ones which are generally thought of as being reliable. Yeah.
When you use the word problematic, what you're actually
Also prohibited. I mean prohibited.
What you're actually saying is it needs to be treated with such fees.
Yeah.
So as long as you're mindful to be treating it with such fees.
Then you're okay.
Yeah.
Now, yeah.
I just want to confirm the stricter.
Yeah, so the stricter approach requires 1/3 of the growing cycle to be before Rosh Hashanah. 1/3 of the growing cycle. The growing cycle is from planting the seed to harvest. It's a certain number of days. 1/3 of those days have to be before Rosh Hashanah, according to the stricter opinion. According to the Chazon Ish, as long as there's some growth before Rosh Hashanah, you're okay. Erev Rosh Hashanah is probably too late, a day or two before. It takes a while for the roots to come out of the seed, right? You need some growth before Rosh Hashanah. The most common practice is in accord with the Chazon Ish on this issue. That's by far the majority practice.
You said earlier that you want to know which
Yeah, well, afterwards, in a different context. I don't want to make a public issue of it. Okay, now here comes one big leniency. almost all the poskim agree that tzvichim, which grow on non-Jewish land, that's a complicated way of saying Arab farms, tzvichim, which grow on Arab farms, are fine, no problem at all. After all, we have no interest in imposing Torah regulations on non-Jews. The Shmittah, together with the rest of the Torah, is for us and not for non-Jews. This is not one of the moral or ethical areas of Torah, which of course should be binding for all humans. This is a purely ritual area of Torah, which obligates us and not them. Of course we have no objection to non-Jews plowing the land on the 7th year and planting seeds and harvesting and doing their agricultural work. I mean, we don't expect them to follow Torah. And since we do not expect them to follow Torah, the whole underlying reasoning why the rabbis prohibited tzvichim doesn't apply to non-Jewish farms. The only reason the rabbis prohibited the vegetables was because Jewish farmers might violate Shmittah and then perpetrate a fraud on the public, making believe that the vegetables just grew by themselves. But a non-Jewish farm, well, of course he can plow the field and plant the seeds and grow the vegetables in the ordinary way, and therefore, vegetables grown on non-Jewish land, all the poskim agree, just about all the poskim agree, no problem at all. Again? No. According to the Minhag of Yerushalayim, produce of non-Jewish farms need not be tithed. That's the practice in Yerushalayim. It's not universal.
I can be certain that the person is actually not Jewish, even though they think he's not Jewish.
For this reason, how do you know whether the cucumber comes from a Jewish farm and is therefore prohibited, period, or does it come from a non-Jewish farm, in which case it's entirely permitted? How are you supposed to know? You need ne'emanut, reliability, trustworthiness of someone who testifies, who says, this cucumber came from a non-Jewish farm. And therefore, the Mahadran Hechsherim, well-known rabbis, whose trustworthiness is accepted by the public, give their certification to certain stores, certain stalls in Machane Yehuda, which are selling non-Jewish cucumbers, and they're okay.
I think that is a person that's raised not Jewish. Actually, let's say there's lots of situations in Israel where you have a woman that's Jewish ends up in a home.
Of course it happens. But this is part of the supervision of the rabbis who signed on the dotted line and said all is well. This is one of a ton of details which they should have looked into, and I have no reason to think that there's any problem in the Mahadran Hechsher. Okay, non-Jewish produce is free of the Isur of Tzvichim. Okay, now this leaves us with big problems. We come to solutions. Yeah.
It's not really a long issue, but there is one issue with having non-Jewish products, in that I don't know if a lot of people are aware of this, but Palestinian farmers use sewage water to produce their products, and from a health perspective. Can
we be a bit more precise? Can we be a bit more precise? They used settled sewage water.
But I suppose Israeli farms that they have to use recycled water. It's a huge difference.
Yeah. Yeah. Look. Cholera. He's talking about cholera. That's what he's talking about. Cholera is a very serious epidemic disease. Huge numbers of people die every year in the world from cholera. Cholera is not the only epidemic disease. In the medical textbooks, diseases like cholera and polio, these epidemic diseases in the medical textbooks are called fecal oral infections. That's the medical way of saying The only way you get these diseases is by swallowing the feces of someone who already has the disease. That is the way people get polio nowadays. Nowadays, people who have polio, it's because the infant, the child, the baby, was vaccinated against polio, and the parents, when they changed the diapers, were not careful enough in washing their hands after changing the diaper. You touch the apple, you eat the apple, you end up swallowing enough of the pathogen. Now the parent has polio. It's a fecal oral infection, which indeed is transmitted by you farmers using settled sewage water, and it's a problem. But in this forum today, what I want to concentrate on are the halachic issues and not the medical issues. Here are the solutions. Solution number one: if you live like I do, if you live in a Haredi neighborhood, so all the problems vanish. If you just buy your fruits and vegetables in a store which has a Mahadran Hechsher, and the Mahadran Hechsher certifies that there are no Shmittah issues in the produce being sold. It's either from the 6th year, or it's from outside the halachic borders of Eretz Yisrael, or it's from a non-Jewish farm. Some solution has been found for every individual item being sold in the Mahadran stores. That's one solution.
You don't have to leave it on the counter for
No, you treat it as normal. You treat it as normal. Second solution. Second solution was proposed by Rav Kook. Back in the days of Rav Kook, before Kum Hamadina, before the state of Israel, back in the glorious days of the British Mandate, there were already a large number of kibbutzim. There were already a large number of Jewish farms, and as Rav Kook observed, he was not the only one who observed this. If the kibbutzim and moshavim, if the Jewish farms back in the 1940s, 1930s, 1940s, if they would have been required to follow all the laws of Shmittah, among the laws, a prohibition to market their produce, if we would have prohibited the Jewish farms from marketing their produce in the 7th year, they would have had to close up shop, abandon the farm, and all of Jewish agriculture would vanish overnight in Eretz Yisrael. Because of Shatat Chak, because of the desperate situation, the need to supply urban dwellers with food, the need to supply Jews in the cities with food back in the mandate period, and because of the risk of Churban HaYishuv, because of the risk of the entire Jewish community in Eretz Yisrael facing destruction if Jewish agriculture would stop for an entire year. Because of this enormous pressure, Rav Kook was moved to develop his famous solution for the whole problem, the Heter Mechira. Heter Mechira works more or less as follows. Just as it is prohibited to own or possess chametz, bread, during Pesach, but you can solve your problem by selling all of your chametz products to a non-Jew before Pesach, and then when Pesach comes, you are not technically in ownership of those products, and all is well. Similarly, Rav Kook reasons, if the land will be sold to a non-Jew before the beginning of the Shemitah year, well, all of the problems of Shemitah do not apply to Arab-owned land, and therefore, if we can get the Jewish farmers to sign on the line, agreeing that their land should belong to a non-Jew during the Shemitah year, then Shemitah will basically vanish from the world, just like the prohibition of owning bread on Pesach vanishes from the world if you follow the correct procedure and make sure that the bread is sold to a non-Jew or the land of the farm is sold to a non-Jew during this year. Now, Rav Kook faced a lot of opposition when he suggested this idea. The opposition is rooted in two fundamental points. First of all, there's a halachic issue, and secondly, there's a practical issue. Let's talk about the practical issue first. Rav Kook thought that the leniency of relying upon the heter mechira was essential in order to preserve the Jewish community in Eretz Yisrael. Well, the people disagreed with him, and they said, no, the farmer, we don't have so many farms, and we'll figure out some other way to keep the farmers busy and find some other livelihood for them for 1 year, and we'll work out some other solution. It's not as desperate as Rav Kook thought. And surely nowadays, many people claim that the situation is not nearly that desperate. The existence of the Jewish community in Eretz Yisrael does not depend upon whether or not Jewish farms are going to work during the Shemitah year or not. The facts are under some dispute. Rav Kook and his followers hold what they hold. There's great motivation, a great reason to rely upon the leniency. The opponents of Rav Kook hold there's really no great need. People can slug it out. Continues to this very day. But on the halachic side, there are also important elements of controversy here. Rav Kook himself was very quick to point out that his entire leniency absolutely depends on Shmittah being rabbinic nowadays and not of Torah status. It's perfectly clear, according to the Mishnah, the Gemara, and all of the poskim, it's perfectly clear that in those times when the mitzvah of Shmittah is a Torah mitzvah, namely when a majority of the Jewish people are living in Eretz Yisrael, at a time when the mitzvah of Shemitah is a Torah mitzvah, this trick, this tahpula, this fiction of selling the land to a non-Jew simply doesn't work. In order to be mafkia kedusha, in order to remove the sanctity from the land by selling the land to a non-Jew, Rav Kook was quick to point out that it's essential that we grasp the opinion that Shemitah nowadays is only of rabbinic status and not of Torah status. This turns out to be controversial. There are great rabbis out there, led by the Soloveitchiks, the Brisk family, but they're by no means the only ones. There are great rabbis out there who hold that Shemitah nowadays is also a Torah commandment, and therefore the heter mechira of Rav Kook, the leniency of Rav Kook, simply doesn't work, because you cannot remove the kedusha from the land just by selling it to a non-Jew. That was the position of the famous Rav Soloveitchik. It's a disagreement among the Rishonim. Rambam, for example, holds that Shemitah is nowadays of Torah status, even though the majority of Am Yisrael lives abroad. And many rabbis, including the Soloveitchiks, follow the Rambam on this issue. Controversy, and you have to decide one way or another. According to Rav Soloveitchik and the others on the strict side of the issue, the leniency of Rav Kook simply doesn't work.
I just a question. Even if a non-Jew owns the land,
We'll come to this in a moment. We'll come to this in a moment.
And the second question I gave you was the demographic one.
Soon the majority of Jews are going to be in Israel, assuming that, very soon, assuming that demographic changes continue as they have been in the last few years, in the very near future, the majority of Am Yisrael will live in Eretz Yisrael, then everyone will agree that Shmittah is of Torah status, and then everyone will agree that the leniency of Rav Kook simply won't work anymore. No, Rav Kook is the inventor of this leniency. No doubt about it. Yeah. This he wrote about this a lot. How is it? It's in general prohibited to sell land in Eretz Yisrael to non-Jews, and how Rav Kook got around this. He himself wrote a lot about this. It's a complicated issue. Rav Kook said, we don't actually sell the land. We sell only the trees, the roots, and a little bit of dirt around the roots. Right? He dealt with this in a very complicated way. One more issue. Although the majority of contemporary rabbis hold that Shmittah nowadays is of rabbinic status, and therefore the leniency of Rav Kook works, although that is the majority view, there's still one big problem here. Namely, as the Chazon Ish pointed out, if the Jewish owner of the farm, if the Jewish kibbutz, the Jewish moshav, is profiting in some way from the sale of the cucumbers and tomatoes, if in some way the Jewish farmers are profiting from the sale of the produce, then of course the prohibition of sfichin must be in place. And therefore, even though the leniency of Rav Kook can work, it cannot possibly work for vegetables, because vegetables will be prohibited under the prohibition of sfichin as long as the Jews are deriving some benefit, some profit from their sale. Somehow they're benefiting from it, and therefore the rabbis are afraid fraud will be committed, and therefore the vegetable should be prohibited. And Rav Kook agreed. Rav Kook agreed that the leniency cannot be applied to vegetables, only to fruits of the tree. Okay? Next. Yes.
After the year is over, when they buy it back, what do they buy it back for? Let's say you sell your field for $1 million shekel, and you buy it back.
Yeah. As with the sale of chametz, you have to find a non-Jew to work with, where you're going to be able to work out a good sale price and repurchase price. You have to find a non-Jew to work with, where everything's going to work out well in this regard. Definitely. Yes. According to Cook, it's okay. Most of the shops, most of the stalls in Machane Yehuda have the rabbinic approval of the Rabbanut, and the ordinary approval of the Rabbanut, the ordinary hechsher of the Rabbanut, the ordinary certificate of the Rabbanut for kashrus depends upon this leniency of Rav Kook. And therefore, those who are following the standards of the Rabbanut have built in to the standards of the Rabbanut the leniency of Rav Kook. As I said a moment ago, the majority of rabbis out there are on board with this leniency, and those who are following it surely are entitled to do so. Anytime that there's a possibility of a Jew committing fraud by saying, the produce just grew by itself, then even if it did grow by itself, it's prohibited because of sfichin, And here we have Jewish farms, kibbutzim and moshavim, who are going to, at the end, be profiting by the sale of their cucumbers. So they're exactly the people against whom Chazal made their prohibition. Yeah, but that's only a fiction. That's only a fiction. The Jews are profiting. Okay?
Practically, if someone with, for a daily restaurant, etc., looks capture, that's good hold by his speaker, would he be able to eat in the restaurant?
Someone who does follow the Rabbanut, but does not want the heter mechir. It's more or less hopeless, because if you do follow the Rabbanut, but don't want to rely upon the heter mechir, just about everything in the restaurant is going to have a little bit of garlic in it, a little bit of kuzbara, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of stuff that came from Bori Pri Adama stuff is going to be more or less in everything. It's more or less hopeless. You either have to follow the Rabbanut or decide you're not going to rely upon the Rabbanut. The other big solution which we have is the Otzer Bezdin. Now, there's a lot of ideology out there, and particularly in the Dati Le'umi world, there's a very strong ideological motivation to try to find a mamlachti, a national solution to the problem in order to enable us to support Jewish farming and simultaneously observe the laws of Shmittah. This has led to, just like Rav Kook invented his leniency, we now have another new leniency which has just been invented quite recently, the leniency of Otzar Bet Din. Now it's true that the words Otzar Bet Din, those three words, do occur in the Tosefta, that's true, but the Tosefta has nothing to say about actually how it's supposed to work, and no rabbi, not in the Mishnah, not in the Gemara, not in the Rishonim, not in the Acharonim, not a single rabbi in the course of centuries has ever had a single word about how Otzar Bet Din is supposed to work, which I suppose is sufficient historic proof that they never actually did it. Because if they ever had an Otzar Bet Din, there would have been tons of questions about how to actually operate it, and rabbis would have had to write endlessly about the details of how to operate an Otzar Bet Din. But quite recently, these three words, Otzar Bet Din, have been resurrected, and now, particularly in the Dati Le'umi world, this is seen as a solution to the whole Shmittah problem. Here is how it works. The produce of the land is seized, confiscated by the Bet Din. You remember that the farmers, according to the halacha, are not allowed to guard their fields. Their fields have to be open to anyone who wants to come in, pluck the fruits, take them home and eat them. So the Bet Din goes in and harvests the entire crop. Now, the Bet Din, the rabbinic court, has a warehouse full of produce. The Bet Din now brings that produce to the market, and the Bet Din sells it in the market. Now, the Bet Din is not a biological human person, it's an organization. And although Jews are prohibited from selling fruits of the 7th year, no one ever prohibited the din from selling them. And therefore, the reasoning of Otzar Bet Din has it. It's the Bet Din which harvests, it's the Bet Din which markets, and we know from last week that fruits of the 7th year cannot be weighed, cannot be measured by volume. You have to sell them only with approximate weights, approximate volume. Well, these prohibitions fall upon Jews. Jews are not allowed to weigh the produce. Jews are not allowed to measure the volume of the wine which they sell. No one ever prohibited the Bet Din from doing this, and therefore the Bet Din will market the fruits in the ordinary way in the marketplace, weighing them and selling them, and the money they get, what are they going to do with all that money that the customers are paying? Oh, they'll be very kind and generous. They'll just fork over that money to the farmers. And now, in the end, the farmers will get exactly the amount of money that they would have gotten had they harvested and marketed the fruits themselves, but they didn't harvest and market the fruits themselves. The Bet Din did it for the farmer. Now, if you know anything about Bet Din, if you know anything about rabbinic courts, you know the rabbis who are the rabbinic court have long gray beards and know nothing about working on a farm, and know nothing about transport and storage of fruits, and know nothing about how to market them. And therefore, the Bet Din needs shlichim, needs emissaries, needs agents who will work for them and do the work for them. So the Bet Din appoints the farmer to be the agent of the Bet Din to harvest the crop. And the Bet Din appoints the merchant in Mahane Yehuda to be his agent to sell the fruits. Oh, it's not the farmer who's harvesting, he's only the agent of the Bet Din. It's not the merchant in the market who's selling, he's only the agent of the Bet Din. And therefore, if the documents are set up correctly and everyone signs correctly on the bottom line, according to this theory, all of the prohibitions of Shmittah vanish. Yeah, well, I hope not. I hope not, because even a Jew is not allowed to plant seeds during the Shmittah year, even on a non-Jewish farm. Even if the Jew is an employee of the non-Jew, still the Jew is not allowed to plant seeds during the Shmittah year. So that should not be happening. But there are many other things which should not be happening. After all, we know that it's prohibited to give fruits of the Shmittah year to non-Jews. We saw that last week. And therefore, the merchant in Mahane Yehuda who signs on a document making himself an agent of the Bet Din agrees not to sell any cucumbers or anything else to non-Jews. How does he know? And if we look in Mahane Yehuda, we see people who look like Filipinos buying vegetables. I mean, I didn't ask for the conversion certificate, but how on earth are they supposed to know? We know from last week that the fruits cannot be exported to Chutz La'aretz. Nonetheless, for the last 5 years, 6 years, I've been getting telephone calls from London and New York, people who bought kosher wine from Eretz Yisrael, and when they bring the wine home, they read on the label, Otzor Bet Din, and they call me up to find out what they have to do with this wine from the Shemitah year. How did it end up in London? How did it end up in New York? I have no idea. Many things are clearly going wrong. On the other hand, there are a number of Otzor Bezdins which are run very carefully. For example, in Komamiyut, a group of Jewish Torah observant Moshavim around Ashkelon, they've gotten together and they have their own little private Otzor Bezdin, but their fruits are not sold in the open market. They are only distributed in private apartments in Torah observant neighborhoods, so that they are not weighed, they are not measured, only approximate weights and measures, and they only go to Torah observant people who will treat them in the correct way. Similarly, Sulam Yaakov is hoping to work out an arrangement where they too will be able to distribute fruits of the Shemitah year in a limited way, not open to the public, where anyone who wants can come and buy, and the cucumbers will be weighed on the scale, rather in a private, in a closed marketing situation where they can control that the customers will be Torah observant and treat the fruits correctly, and they won't actually be sold by weight and measure. That there are Otzur Bezdins which work very carefully, but many don't. Yeah, well, if the Otzur Bezdin is just a fake, I mean, if it's all just a fraud, if it's just all Labar Ita Ayin because it looks good, if it doesn't really work, then we are in trouble, because the money you pay for the fruits, as we learned last week, acquires Kedusha of Shmittah, and that's going to end up in general circulation, and those coins can only be used to buy other fruits which will be eaten the correct way according to the laws of Shmittah. That's one problem. Another big problem is, if it's done incorrectly, by participating in the fraud, you're only encouraging them to do more. And that's not right. Bottom line, the three approaches you can take are either stick with the Haredim, number two, stick with the Rabbanut, the Otzar, stick with the Rabbanut based on the Heter Mechira of Rav Kook, or go with the Otzar Bet Din solution. Whichever approach you take, you want to make sure that things are done correctly according to whichever approach it is you choose.
Even if it is moving or loving or something, or you can into it, are they planting?
No, I hope not. No, if it's well supervised, no planting. They don't. Only in the very beginning of the Shemitah year, when it was planted in the 6th year, in the beginning of the Shemitah year, they have vegetables.
And then what? Just doesn't happen to grow?
Well, apples grow whether you plant them or not. The apple tree produces every year. No, vegetables they have only in the beginning of the Shemitah year, because they were planted in the 6th year. There's no actual planting in the 7th year. And therefore no vegetables available, unless the vegetables come from Chutz La'aretz or non-Jewish farms. Yeah, I mentioned last time there's some controversial areas. There are areas which are definitively not in Eretz Yisrael, and last time I dealt with those different areas.
Is there a person using this various like imported fruit and vegetables and using those other things is it advisable to treat everything the same, or is that
No, only the stuff which grew in Eretz Yisrael requires. When in doubt, you can be strict.
But it's okay to then just say to yourself, oh, I'm just going to put planted and rock or put in compost.
You can, yes. Yeah. Yes, you can be strict. Okay, final question for tonight.
Originally, wasn't there some sort of understanding that the purpose of Shmittah was to give the land a year of rest?
No, it was to give the farmers a year of rest.
To the farmer.
Right. And back in those days, when farming was not a commercial enterprise, farmers grew for themselves. There was a little bit extra to sell. Back in those days, the farmers really could devote the year to spiritual enterprise. They have more time for learning Torah and spiritual growth. Nowadays, when all our farms are commercial, we have all the problems we have today. So, with this, we come to the end of our series. If you have any questions, you feel free to contact me on an individual basis, and I'll be happy to try to help.
Thank you very much. I'm sure many of you already know Rav Fink teaches halacha in our yeshiva Wednesday mornings at 11:10. It's open to men and women. And it's 18 Hagilboa, you're most welcome to come. And in addition to that, we have many other great classes. We'd love to see you. And before we go, just a quick, Daniel wants to make, Daniel, right? Ari Cantor wants to make an announcement. And just 1 second. And like I said, the last 2 weeks, these lectures are a community service, but if anybody wants to make a contribution to the yeshiva, you're most welcome. You can give it to myself or to Tzipi. And if you want to sign in for our newsletter, there's a sign-in sheet over here as well. So we wish you a ksiva v'chsima tova. You should have a good year, you and all of Israel, all over.
Everybody, I'm with the Sulam Yaakov Shmittah Cooperative Group. We're going to be buying from